recovery, which is consistent with the main recovery mechanisms here that we've identified. Good. So before we go in and revisit this gas HnP PVT experiment, we can see if there's any questions before we move along. Good. So what this section actually covers is, after some mixing process, I guess has occurred, and you actually have injection gas and reservoir fluid that's able to contact what is happening at that point. And we talked about that earlier, where we had this gas HnP PVT experiment, where we essentially combined a constant volume injection experiment and a constant volume depletion experiment that we did in a cyclic manner, and that was to make sure that we had a PVT experiment with all the characteristics of the huff and puff process: injection periods with associated pressure buildup, production periods with associated pressure drawdown, cyclic nature, and oil recovery versus number of cycles or relative moles injected. We showed this particular cartoon where we started at the minimum bottom or at some minimum pressure, increased the pressure by introducing an injection gas composition that's relevant for your field, and we increased the pressure until a maximum pressure, typically determined by local fracture gradients, before we reduce the pressure again, and essentially to ensure that we have constant volume, we remove a certain percentage of mass from that PVT cell. And with that, we have a experiment that can actually quantify recovery of these components right here, or the components here, C6 plus components in general, or C5 doesn't really matter. So the components that, at least on surface, translates into stock tank oil that we sell and use in our cars for gasoline and diesel and jet fuel and whatnot. As I mentioned earlier, what we can do is to use that to analyze different injection gas compositions, for instance, for the same reservoir fluid. Here we see just cycle number, and here we see recovery factor of C6 plus components, but just think about C6 plus as stock tank barrels. So this is just a recovery factor of oil essentially here. And this is the minimum pressure and the maximum pressure. And the reason why we use recovery factor of C6 plus is that C6 plus represents the components in the reservoir that can translate into sellable stock tank oil. And as we see, in terms of pressure, if we increase the maximum pressure, the recovery factor, or if we take this example right here, here's around 40%, while here it's around 45% right here. So higher pressure is in general true, but in this case, since we remove components at the same pressure, if we normalize for the relative moles of gas injection, or to make it simple, just the MCF of gas injected versus stock tank barrels right here, that's the way we can think about it, we actually see that the recovery efficiency at, for instance, this point is the same in both cases. So the only thing that happens when you increase the pressure is that you just make sure that you fit more gas into that pore space. So if you have more gas into a particular pore space and the EOR efficiency is the same, the pore space that fits the most gas will yield the highest recovery for a particular cycle. Again, reiterating this thing about importance of volume. So high recovery is simply due to a larger volume of gas injected in the PVT cell per cycle. What I mentioned earlier is that what's probably even more important the reason why I remove these things here is that these are the things we measure in the PVT labs. That's stuff that laboratory folks are measuring, but these are things that we can very simply convert to readable oil field units. So I just would like you to think about this in terms of oil field units, so stock tank barrels per MCF. We showed this particular example earlier in the course, but we'll reiterate it here to make sure that it's 100% clear. Again, recovery efficiency is up to the left, and we can think about this as stock tank barrels per MCF. And this the ratio right here is just a measure of EOR efficiency, stock tank barrels per MCF. So if we only remove mass at pressures below the saturation pressure, so when we're below the saturation pressure, what do we know then if we have a PVT cell? This is A. Well, we know that we have a liquid phase and we have a gas phase. Then we know that, okay, in a CVD experiment, so if we, in a CVD experiment, what we do is we remove excess volume to make sure we're at constant pressure. And the volume that we remove is gas. By definition, the only thing that can recover components when we are in two phases is by vaporization. So the components from the reservoir oil equilibrate and essentially vaporize into the gas phase. The gas phase is carried out to the surface and is then at surface separated to a surface oil and a surface gas. And the incremental oil, so the additional oil recovery is produced and achieved through the surface oil right here. On the opposite, as we talked about as well, is when the mass is always removed above the minimum miscibility pressure. Then we know that we either have a single phase reservoir oil or we have a single phase reservoir gas, which doesn't really matter which one we have, because what matters is how much C6 plus components we have in that particular PVT cell or pore space in the field. What we know is that the reason why we remove mass is due to swelling. The composition of what swells, that's removed, and the composition of what's left in the PVT cell is the same. Recovery efficiency is driven by a pure dilution process, and you get a very, very high efficiency right here, which is indicated by this line. And again, if you do something in between, which is what you probably would expect in the field, you will get to something that's very efficient the first cycles. So this is the region that is pure mixing driven, while after a while it will be vaporization driven. And what we mean by that is that, you know, up until this point, in this region right here, that PVT cell is a single phase, either single phase oil or a single phase gas, while after that we have a oil phase and a gas phase right here. And the only way we can produce additional components is through this gas phase. Good. So just to make it clear, the comparison of the different mechanisms. So scenario 1 shows a process dominated by vaporization only with a relatively low recovery efficiency. Slope, the process is characterized by fresh injection gas contacting and equilibrating with the oil, stripping out small amounts of intermediates and light heavies. So intermediates and light heavies, so intermediates, just to make sure that I mentioned that, I think intermediates we can say is when I talk about that, I think this will be probably correct. C6 maybe to C30, let's say C29. So this is just some rule of thumb numbers, but components that are able to vaporize. So you can't vaporize the most heavy stuff. So the heavies or the heavies would be C30 plus, the components that are heavier than that, and that we can't vaporize, and that's not available for vaporization. And that will essentially yield, if we made if we did the Huff and Puff PVT experiment and we did a similar curve as what we do for the slim tube experiment, that's essentially why we would get a decreasing, I guess, recovery efficiency as we go further down right here, because we're leaving these C30 plus components in the PVT cell, and they'll not be possible to vaporize. The totally opposite case is a process dominated by mixing only. This is what we call pure mixing. Some people call it contacting the oil and gas to contact. And that's because the production is happening above the MMP by first contact. And note how the recovery efficiency is the most efficient process. And scenario B is especially interesting because it changes slope after a few contacts. And first is a process dominated by pure mixing. And thereafter, the main recovery process changes and is dominated by vaporization only, which has a lower recovery efficiency or a lower slope. And this is the last time I'll make this analogy, but this pure mixing analogy is freshwater, saltwater mixing, starting with a cup with salt water, half a cup of salt water, introduce half a cup of fresh water, and we stir this together. We empty half of the cup. We now have half of the salt concentration again left in the cup. And if we continue to do this, we'll end up with pure fresh water. And that's exactly the same as what will happen if we inject in a pore space above the first contact miscibility pressure, that the composition in that pore space will converge to become the injection gas composition. The only thing that this thing doesn't account for, that's swelling, because salt water and fresh water doesn't swell. I have several cases here. So now this is the second time we've gone through this, but we'll introduce a little bit more complexity in terms of the production part, or the CVD part of the gas Huff and Puff PVT experiment. So remember that this part of the when we increase the pressure, that's called as constant volume injection experiment, a CVI. While the production period, which is probably a more famous experiment, is the constant volume depletion experiment. And in all of the results and everything that we've talked about so far, we've actually only removed mass at one pressure, and it's been the minimum pressure. And that's indicated right here. But actually, in reality, when we're producing during a puff cycle, we're producing at decreasing bottom hole pressure. So actually, a multi-stage CVD would be more representative of what's happening in the field, right? So this is a multi-stage CVD where we remove mass at 9,000, 8,000, 7,000, 6,000, etc., and not only the last stage right here. The recovery efficiency at all these pressures right here will probably be a single phase, at least the first cycles, and then the further we go down here, the lower the recovery efficiency will be. And we'll look at the compositional signatures from that a little bit later. The only thing we know is that if we have a higher, the recovery efficiency is the highest above the MMP by first contact. So the recovery efficiency per definition will be the same all the time at all these pressures. It will be exactly the same. The barrels per million will be exactly the same. While at these pressures below here, they will decrease all the way down, and it'll be worse and worse and worse, and be actually the worst at the lowest pressure, because that's where the carrying capacity of the gas is the lowest. Which means, okay, what's the carrying capacity of the gas? For those of you who are familiar with modified black hole tables, that's RV, as I mentioned before, vaporized oil ratio, which is what it's called in CMG, Eclipse, Harmony, ResFrac, and whatnot. SB's nomenclature for that is just the little RS, which also called the solution CGR, so condensate gas ratio. Okay, so EOR efficiency is decreasing. Yeah, sorry about that. And if we compare that, so obviously if we compare that to a single stage type of CVD experiment, that will be much more efficient, right? The recovery factor. So if we have recovery factor right here versus scuffs injected, that will be higher than for a single stage. So if we had a single stage right here, it'll probably go something like this, or yeah, something below. Good. The reason why we wanted to do this and add this type of complexity is that since that's more representative of what we should expect in the field, then maybe we can use that compositional signature and see if we actually are seeing that compositional signature in the field. And the compositional trends that we see from a huff and puff experiment like this, and I'll write what these different things is in terms of oil fin units. So this is API gravity. This is GOR, this is methane content, and this is C7 plus content. Okay, and this could in theory be C6 plus content for that matter. It's the components that are heavy and that translates into stock tank oil, and at surface they become stock tank oil essentially. And if we look at the trends, the producing stock tank GOR over cycles decrease. Producing GOR increases, wellstream C1 increases, and wellstream C7 plus decreases. And does that make sense? That's the question. First of all, we said that, okay, if we have a process where you inject that the pressure is above this first contact miscibility pressure, at some point you'll converge to become the injection gas composition. And your injection gas will have a very, very high GOR. And if it's a dry gas, it will have an infinite GOR. So we know that per definition, if something should converge to become the injection gas, then the GOR should increase. Your GOR will probably don't have a lot of the heavier components, which essentially is what contributes to your API numbers, and that's why these API numbers right here above the saturation pressure, the API numbers are constant. We see that in every single cycle. These are constant. The reason for that is that composition is constant, and when composition is constant, the API is constant. Okay. And we're accessing here when through the cycle as we produce at lower and lower pressures, the carrying capacity of the solution or of the gas at lower pressure goes down. So we can't carry that many heavy components in our gas that we produce to surface. Hence, the API within the cycle is decreasing. No, increasing, sorry, that we see here. And the last thing to emphasize here, and C1 content and GOR content, they're essentially correlated, right? And these type of trends is stuff that we can look for actively in the field to try to analyze what's happening throughout the transients of a puff cycle. And this is called compositional tracking, which is the topic of the two papers that we presented at URTEC 2019 and 2020, which is interesting topics where you definitely can evaluate whether you're having a true mixing process or not. This is the second time we go through this gas huff and puff experiment. The reasons is that we think it's communicating some key fundamental properties of the huff and puff project. It can also provide you, so this experiment itself can actually provide you with a key metric that you can get this number for a relevant set of reservoir fluid, reservoir temperature, and injection gas composition, and you can communicate that number to management, for instance, instead of just MMPs and these things that might be a little bit more abstract. On that note, I think I'll probably leave it to Dion. Any questions or anything related to this? Maybe there's some questions. Yeah, any questions related to that experiment?
If no one else have it, I have one question for the slide 159, the last slide.
Yeah.
We just covered. So looking at the statement that PVT half and puff experiment can provide or quantify the EOR efficiency. So this is representing the efficiency after the mixing has occurred, right?
Yeah.
So some of that efficiency would be reduced, right? Because it's all limited by how much you can access, right? Or the accessibility, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
So this number will be an upper limit, right? So because what it essentially is, a PVT cell, that's an instantaneous diffusion process. It's a perfect mix. It's perfect mixing in the PVT cell, and it's like a flash calculation with a PVT package. So this is an upper limit for sure. That said, though, in these experiments by ERC and whatnot, you actually see that you can get 100% recovery from diffusion on these plugs of rock just within the time scale of a day, 24 hours. So if you inject for 30 days, there's a lot of rock volume in your reservoir, or that the gas or at least potentially can contact and mix with through diffusion. And if it's mixed, at least in that part of the reservoir where it contacts the reservoir fluid, this will be a very representative number.
Got it. Thanks.
And now we're actually gonna, I think what's important to emphasize is that, this is a PVT experiment. All PVT, there's no PVT experiment out there that actually replicates a depletion process in the reservoir, maybe except from CVD experiment for gas condensate reservoirs. So that is probably the closest. But the PVT experiments are these tank models and conceptual models. They're good because they provide order of magnitude and directional information. They provide a lot of good understanding. You can only look at you can isolate fluid to fluid. But that said, when we actually apply these and when we measure this, what we do is that we model the lab experiments with a fluid model, which is what we discussed as an introductory note, which was this equation of state model. But then we apply that equation of state model in a reservoir simulation exercise where we account for time, we account for other types of fluids, we account for transients. We also account for rock fluid interactions and whatnot. And that's the remaining part of the course, is going to see, okay, we understand the PVT now. Matthias has said it 6,000 times, and I think I understand the most important things. But how does this, together with what's happening in the reservoir, translate into a positive EOR response? And with that, Stian is going to help us all, which is the next